All right, let's talk about climate change. Climate change is really a bunch of different questions together. So let's talk about some of the questions separately. First of all, is the Earth actually warming right now? What's the evidence for that? Is the warming abnormal? Because things change. Earth gets warmer, Earth gets cooler. How do we know that what we're currently experiencing is abnormal? What factors affect global temperature? What do we know about climate in 2023? And are we causing this warming? Is the warming abnormal? And if it is, what's the evidence that humans are causing it? These are all scientific questions that can be addressed by looking for the evidence. And lastly, is the warming a bad thing? Now, that question is subjective. And if we want to make it a scientific question, we need to change the question by making it much more specific. What species are being affected? What's happening with the level of the ocean? Are hurricanes getting worse? So we have to take that last subjective question and change it into something more specific. So what do we know about what affects our climate? It's been known for a long time, over 100 years, that particular gases in our atmosphere hold in heat from the sun and help keep the atmosphere of our planet warmer than it would be if the heat completely escaped at night. And this is called the greenhouse effect. Similar to a greenhouse where you would grow plants, you can grow orchids in Alaska if you have a greenhouse, because a greenhouse holds in the heat from the sun at night and keeps things warmer. So not every gas in the atmosphere does this. And we now know the most effective greenhouse gases, because of their large quantity in the atmosphere and their effect as a greenhouse gas, are water vapor, which we can't do a lot about that, carbon dioxide, which is the one we probably hear about the most, methane, and nitrous oxide. So these four gases are the ones of concern. Now we want some warmth. We want the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect helps keep the Earth livable. Without these gases, the Earth would be an ice ball. So, is the Earth currently warming? Well, here, let me get my pointer back here. So we've only been measuring temperatures for about 150 years. Before that, humans did not have an instrument to measure the temperature, nor did we have the idea of Fahrenheit or Celsius or any way to describe it. So since we have been measuring temperatures on a worldwide basis, yes, there has been a steady increase, and this is data from 4 different sources here, and there are others as well. One is NASA, and the other one here that's a U.S. one is NOAA, which is the National Oceanographic and Aeronautic Agency. Japanese Meteorological Society. I believe the Hadley Center is a European agency. So you can see, since humans have been measuring temperatures all over the world, the average global temperature has been increasing. And of course, we've gotten more accurate recently because we're measuring temperatures at more points all over the planet. Of course, when we first started measuring temperatures, there weren't very many places on the planet where there were humans with thermometers who were actually measuring the temperature. But it seems pretty clear that things have been warming. We know that in ancient times, the climate has sometimes been colder, sometimes been warmer. How do we know that what we're seeing right now isn't just part of the normal, up and down of the temperatures, as has been argued by people? Well, for that, we need to know ancient temperatures. We need to go back further than 150 years. And how do we do that? Well, luckily, there are several places where ice has been frozen for hundreds of thousands of years, up to 800,000 years in some places. Mainly Antarctica, which is where the South Pole is, and Greenland. which is the Arctic Circle goes through Greenland. Both of those places haven't completely melted for over 500,000 years. And year after year, snow piles up and does not melt. And as that snow gets compressed, little bubbles of atmosphere get trapped in the ice. And we can directly sample the atmosphere, these little bubbles of ancient atmosphere, and measure some things directly, like carbon dioxide and methane. We can just measure that directly in the bubbles. But that doesn't tell us the temperature. Temperature, we can get a pretty good approximation by using the oxygen isotope ratio. As we'll talk about when we get to chemistry, an isotope is an atom with a different mass. It's the same element but a different mass. So oxygen exists in two different isotopes, and their ratio of these two different isotopes varies with the temperature. So that can give us an estimate of ancient temperatures as well. So what do these tell us? Well, when they first started to figure this out in the 1970s, they found something really shocking. So if we look at the x-axis here, this goes back, so this is year, not years ago. So it goes back to 10,000 BC. So that's, or BCE. So that is 12,000 years ago. And that was still during the last ice age. That was the very end of the last ice age. And here is the estimate of the average global temperature based on the oxygen isotope ratios from these ice cores. And you can see that the estimate is that it was quite warm a few thousand years ago, and then it has been cooling for the last 4,000 years. And when this was first noticed, some people immediately said, oh man, we're headed for another ice age. But we're not. And so the way that you can look at that fact that this is an estimate here is the light blue area around here, that's the error bars. So the real temperature, there's a 95% certainty that it's somewhere inside of these gray bars. So that gives you an idea of how they figure out how accurate they might be. And then the red here, which is overlaid, that's actual measured temperatures for the last 150 years. So you can see that the original temperatures that were measured, and now we are way up here. We are currently at the warmest in this epoch, the Holocene, which has been since the end of the last ice age. We are the warmest that it's been. And here's some 3 overlaid graphs here of these Antarctic ice bubbles. So the top one here is carbon dioxide. The middle one here, the green one, is methane. And the bottom one here is temperature based on oxygen isotope estimates. And this is, in this case, the present is over here on the far left. And this goes back 450,000 years. And so you can see when there's an ice age, when the temperature is low, methane is low, CO2 is also low. When it's an interglacial, when there is no ice age, temperature's warmer, methane's higher, CO2 is higher. So at least what we can tell from this is there is a coincidence between high CO2, high methane, and high temperatures globally. And then here we are in the warm, recent 10,000 years here with high methane and high CO2. Right now, CO2 levels are the highest in 800,000 years. And remember, the CO2, the ancient CO2 levels, we can just measure that directly. That is just something we are just measuring it in these ice bubbles. And we can measure that directly. And again, this goes back 450,000 years, and now this graph is flipped 180 degrees with the present over here on the right. And we have just CO2 levels and temperature, and we see CO2 levels here. The green line is CO2 levels, And currently, we are above 400 parts per million. So this graph is a few years old, and we're already up here. We're already above 400 parts per million. So clearly, by far, CO2 is the highest that it's been in 800,000 years. Not the highest it's ever been. It has been higher in the past when the Earth was much hotter than it is today. We are nowhere near the hottest the Earth has ever been. So couldn't this just be due to something else, like variation in the sun's intensity? The sun does vary on an 11-year cycle, with sunspots reaching a peak and then going down. So on the bottom here, this goes back, shows about 20 years here, going back to the late 70s. Sun's energy that's reaching Earth is going up and down and up and down, and it doesn't really correspond at all to the average global temperature. In fact, we are currently just coming out of a low, so we should actually be cool right now. So we're heading for another peak of sun intensity, which we're going to hit in about 5 years. What about the Ice Age interglacial cycles that have been going on for the last few billion years? The so-called Milankovitch cycles, that's caused by wobbling in the Earth's orbit. The Earth's orbit gets more circular and more oval, and we also have a little bit of a wobble in the angle of the axis. Of course, the Earth's axis, we don't, as we go around the sun, the axis of the Earth isn't straight up and down, it's tilted, and this tilt kind of wobbles a little bit. According to this hypothesis, which is used to explain the ice ages, we should be cooling right now. We should be heading for another ice age, but clearly not in a cooling trend. We've also been directly measuring CO2 in the atmosphere in Hawaii. So why Hawaii? Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's very far from any large population centers. The biggest city in the Hawaiian Islands complex is not on the big island of Hawaii, where this observatory is. It's on the island of Oahu. So, and this is also at very high elevation. So it's considered to be the best place to measure directly the average amount of CO2 in the atmosphere in the northern hemisphere. There's another place in the southern hemisphere where they're also measuring carbon dioxide. But the red line here is that direct carbon dioxide measurement. And we can see this starts in 1958. And notice that the y-axis does not start with 0. The bottom of the y-axis here is 310 parts per million. And this was probably already an increase from where it was 200 years before. We just weren't measuring it. So, and you can see every year it kind of goes up and down and up and down and up and down. And that is because in the winter it goes up, and in the summer it goes down in the northern hemisphere, because in the summer that's when the photosynthesis is at its maximum. So in the summer in the northern hemisphere we have plants taking in CO2 from the atmosphere, and that causes it to go down a little bit. And then in the winter, photosynthesis slows, goes back up. And you can see that this steady increase here, it does correspond to this, to the increase in temperature, although the temperature has a different y-axis. And remember what I said about taking two different y-axes and showing a correlation. We still need to make sure we're paying attention to cause and effect and not just looking at correlations as cause and effect. But it's a very suspicious correlation. So, and you'll notice here, so this y-axis here has the carbon dioxide, and we are above 400 parts per million now. This only goes to 2018. And so we're probably above, if this trend continues, we're probably above 410 parts per million now. This is, things get out of date so fast. So temperature's still going up, CO2 still going up. Although the rate of increase, we have made a difference. Legislation in recent years has made a difference. And there is less CO2 going into the atmosphere than if things had stayed the same as 5 years ago. So a little bit of improvements. Okay, so what happened? Let's look at a much more compact time instead of looking at 10,000 years or 400,000 years. Let's just look at the last 2,000 years. So again, these amounts of these gases are measured from ice cores. We can measure the amount of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide in the atmosphere from these ancient samples directly. And then since 1950 to now, we can measure it, we are measuring it directly in the atmosphere. And you can see, starting around 1700, there is a sharp increase in all of these in the atmosphere. And it is very difficult to argue that this is some kind of a natural phenomena. There are natural sources of all three of these things. Volcanic activity is a big source of carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide. It has been a source in the past that has caused warming events in the past, like the Great Permian extinction that was right at the beginning of the age of the dinosaurs. Huge increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, probably due to volcanic activity. We actually have had low volcanic activity for the last few hundred years. There has not been a large increase in volcanic activity that could explain this. Methane comes from natural sources like decaying plant material in a low oxygen environment, like think swamps and peat bogs and stuff are a big natural source of methane. Nitrous oxide comes from soil bacteria and decaying plant material as well. So all of these have natural sources, but this cannot be readily explained by natural events. What could explain it? Well, the Industrial Revolution started in the 1700s, and what really changed in terms of the gases in the atmosphere was that we started burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are coal, oil, and natural gas. And coal was first. We were using coal to fire factories and steam engines. And then in the mid-1800s, it started to be replaced by oil. And then we had gasoline and the gasoline-powered engine and diesel-powered engines. And so those increased dramatically. And the burning of fossil fuels puts all of those things in the atmosphere. Methane ends up in the atmosphere from the extraction and processing of coal and oil. Burning coal and oil releases CO2 and nitrous oxide. Another way to tell that it's humans that have something to do with the change in climate that's going on right now is that when there were fewer humans, briefly because of the Black Death, there was actually a cooling event. So the Black Plague, or bubonic plague, we now know that it was now, killed 50% of the population of Europe and Asia, from England all the way to Japan down to the southern tip of India, starting in 1350, and it happened multiple times over the next few hundred years, where approximately 50% of the population died multiple times. So world population went down. Around the same time, a few hundred years later, starting in the 1500s and 1600s, we had a huge population decline in North and South America of the indigenous peoples there due to colonization. So we have fewer people, both in North and South America, but mainly in Europe. None of these events, at least as early as 1350, doesn't seem to have affected populations in Africa. But it caused something called the Little Ice Age. And there has been a lot of speculation about what caused the Little Ice Age. One hypothesis is that there was a solar minimum around this time, and that could have added to it. But most scientists think that there was actually an atmospheric CO2 reduction that we can see from measuring the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from these ice cores. So a solar minimum doesn't explain the lowering in CO2 in the atmosphere. So there were fewer people, less CO2 in the atmosphere because this was pre-industrial revolution. So it was from fewer cooking fires, fewer forests being burned and cleared. Forests were growing back and replacing farms and fields that had been cleared. So photosynthesis increased, number of people burning things went down, and we had a cooling event. Here's another view of that the little ice age temperature anomaly, where and it didn't happen immediately. So it was like 100 years after the first wave of the Black Death, but clearly this is further evidence that humans had something to do with the changing climate, because when there was fewer people, things got a little cooler temporarily. So which gases are increasing the most, and which sources are contributing the most? So this little graph here, we have each bar, and notice the years here, 1970, 80, 90, 2000, 2010. Each bar has parts from different places. So the red is carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. So that includes coal, oil, and natural gas. And you can see that that has increased quite a lot. In fact, it's almost doubled. Methane from agriculture, waste, and that would be like rotting garbage in landfills, and energy. So that means oil extraction, some methane escapes during oil extraction, and coal processing also releases some methane. And there is some methane from agriculture. And you can see that's the purple here. And that has increased, but barely. There has not been a big increase in those sources of methane. We have developed ways to decrease the amount of methane that's going into the atmosphere. A lot of methane gets burned into carbon dioxide before it enters the atmosphere. CO2 from deforestation, decay, and peat bogs. So CO2 from deforestation, this means that this is from less photosynthesis. So as the amount of forest is decreased, forests are a big sink for CO2 because photosynthesis absorbs CO2. So as areas are deforested, more CO2 remains in the atmosphere. So you can see this as well. Fairly substantial increase. Almost, this yellow bar has almost doubled in size since 1970. And then the nitrogen oxides from agriculture and other sources have also doubled, but they're a smaller piece of the pie here. So this is from burning fossil fuels, rotting plant material, soil bacteria. And so you can see here, we've gone, this is not quite doubling, but the things that have increased the most are burning fossil fuels and deforestation. Those are the biggest contributors, and anything else is a distraction as far as I'm concerned. Because when we have 70% of the problem is fossil fuels, that's where our focus should be, is decreasing fossil fuels and increasing the amount of areas that are covered by forest, because that's the biggest contributors. Anything else is just trying to distract us with details. So, and lastly, is it bad? The answer seems to be yes, but let's make those more specific. How many species are going extinct? What is the extent of coral bleaching? Are any corals recovering? How can we measure the rising sea level? Which populations are going to be most affected by the rising sea level? So subjective questions, we need to be much more specific. So I use that as an example. Global warming is a really good example of looking back over 100 years and seeing how the science of climate has evolved. And what data do we have to answer those specific scientific questions. So to be a science, science has experimentation to verify our hypotheses. Once you're ready to share your results, they need to be peer-reviewed. And we see catastrophes happen all the time when scientists decide to go straight to press conference without allowing their work to go through peer review, because sometimes they're completely wrong about what they think they found. Experiments must have control groups, and that's what we call a controlled trial or a controlled experiment. That means there's a group that does not get the treatment. And we need control groups, whether you're talking about chemistry, cells in a dish, or you're testing new medicines. Results have to be repeatable by anybody, and if your scientific results cannot be replicated by other labs, then something is wrong. Either you were sloppy or you're manipulating your data or something. Luckily, that's rare. Science only deals with the natural world. It is not the only way to know about the world. It's not the only type of knowledge. But it's the best way we know of to figure out how things in the world work. Results have to be objective, meaning that anybody could see that same result. Not a matter of opinion, not subjective. Let's talk about a hypothesis versus a theory. Hypothesis is a preliminary idea. It's an idea of how things work. You might have data for a hypothesis. You might not have any data at all. You might just be doing a thought experiment. Hypotheses change a lot. We cannot get too attached to a hypothesis because data could mean that we have to throw it away. A theory, on the other hand, in science, if we call something a theory, it is backed up by years of data and experiments. It is generally accepted by the scientific community as being a good explanation for the data that we see. Theory in everyday speech means a preliminary idea. So if you say, well, I lost my car keys, but I have a theory about where I left them, that is a hypothesis, not a theory. So theories, any scientific theory could be thrown away with new data. No scientific theory is above criticism. And sometimes theories that have been around for hundreds of years do get overturned, and I will show you some examples of that. They don't get overturned very often, though, because to even become a theory, it has to have a lot of data to back it up. Science is always changing, and this is sometimes disconcerting for the general public when they see science happening in front of them, like over the course of the pandemic. Scientists change their minds and have new hypotheses as new data comes in, and people say, well, they don't know what they're talking about then. They keep changing their minds. Yes, that is exactly how science works. Our conclusions are based on the most current data. So if there was a paper published 2 years ago that showed something interesting, and since then 10 more studies have been done that disproved that and showed that that was a bunch of garbage, we have to go with the most recent data, and our hypothesis, even though it was interesting, has to go in the garbage can. So some of the big theories that we're going to talk about over the course of the semester. One of the first ones that we're going to talk about in the second module, we're going to talk about cell theory. Cell theory replaced an earlier theory called the theory of spontaneous generation. Cell theory has 3 important parts. One is that all cells come from other cells. Right now on Earth, there aren't any new cells appearing from non-cells. Although we'll talk about the origin of life at some point. That had to happen. But right now, every cell on Earth is from the division of another cell. Cells are the smallest thing we consider alive, so if you take a cell apart and take out its constituent parts, like we take out the DNA or take out the chromosomes, we no longer consider those bits to be living. Every cell has a membrane, and the membrane is the outer border of that cell. The person who first provided laboratory experimental data for cell theory was Louis Pasteur. You've probably all heard of Pasteur. His experiments replaced the previous theory called the theory of spontaneous generation, which was around for 2,000 years at least. Probably we could blame that one on Aristotle as well. And the idea of spontaneous generation was that life is spontaneously appearing from non-living things. People could see evidence with their own eyes. If you have freshly cooked soup, for example, and you take a drop and put it under the microscope, there's nothing alive in there. If you leave it out for a few days and you look at a drop under the microscope, oh, now it's full of cells. There's bacteria in there. Eventually there's going to be fungi growing in there. If you leave it out long enough, you're going to have worms and maggots and flies hatching out of that soup. This seemed to be great evidence to people that life was evolving in that soup, and simpler life was turning into more complex life, and those first cells that appeared were just appearing spontaneously. There was even a recipe for making mice that appeared in the Farmer's Almanac in the early U.S. publication, which was, what was his name? Benjamin Franklin, his little publication. So to make mice, they said if you took a dirty work shirt, so sweaty, dirty work shirt, put it in a burlap sack with some wheat grains and close it up. If you came back after, and then throw it in the corner of your barn or something, if you came back after 21 days, those little microbes will have turned into mice. It sounds ridiculous now, but I mean, this was considered a theory that had evidence. So Pasteur said, I don't think that's true. Pasteur was working with bacteria in his lab, and he kept getting the same species of bacteria over and over and over. And he said, well, if they're just appearing spontaneously, why are they always the same? Why do I keep getting the same species? And so he came up with a new hypothesis, and that was that there are bacteria in the air and fungal spores in the air, and they are just landing in the growth media and growing. So nothing is appearing spontaneously. In fact, they are growing from other cells. And so his experiment to test that, he invented this little flask and had somebody make them for him. And they were open to the atmosphere. So he used beef broth for most of his experiments, clear broth, because it's very easy to tell, as you'll find out when you're in microbiology. If your broth gets contaminated and starts growing bacteria, it becomes cloudy. So if you're looking at that broth and it's still clear, there's nothing growing in it. And they knew that if you boiled liquids, you would kill all the organisms in there. So this particular type of flask with this spout, nothing could blow in there, but it still allowed the exchange of gases. So oxygen and carbon dioxide could exchange. And so for his control, he took the same flask, boiled the broth to sterilize it, and then broke the top off. So it had access to things falling down in the room. And that one, of course, became contaminated and grew bacteria. The one that was open to the atmosphere, but nothing could fall in there, no growth. There's a museum in Paris where they still have some of his flasks from the 1860s. Of course, it's, 150-year-old beef broth, but you can still see that the broth is clear and that there's nothing growing in it. So this proved that it was not spontaneous generation that was leading to microbial growth. In fact, these microbes were already in the atmosphere and were just blowing into and contaminating whatever it was. And you'll find this out too if you're going to take micro, that you have to just think as you do things that there is just bacteria and fungal spores just raining down on you constantly. And even when you open your Petri dishes, you just have to just like quickly open them or open them upside down, because otherwise it's going to have everything in there. So that was the first experimental evidence for what we now call cell theory. We're also going to spend a lot of time talking about the theory of heredity. And the theory of heredity is both about DNA and the structure of DNA and how those genes are expressed. And we're going to talk about genetics and Mendel, the first person who kind of started the field of genetics. And we'll also talk about this, and that'll be Module 4. And we'll talk about the structure of DNA and the discovery of DNA and the background on that in Module 5. We'll talk about energy conservation. Energy from the sun is the fuel for all life on Earth, one way or another, through photosynthesis. And we will talk in Module 3 about photosynthesis, about respiration, and how energy isn't created, it is converted from one form to another. So all the energy for life on Earth is ultimately coming from the sun. Every bit of energy that you are using right now came from photosynthesis. All the energy in the ATP that's being used in your body came from the sun, and that energy being converted by photosynthesis into energy in some plant which you ate, or you ate an animal that ate that plant. That's the conservation of energy. We will talk about evolution, and we'll also talk a bit about the origin of life, which is kind of the beginning of evolution. We have several labs that also have to do with evolution. So here's our 3 domains here: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes, and our very ancient split. So at the beginning of Module 2, we're going to talk about the origin of life down here, and this ancient split and the origin of eukaryotes a little bit as well. It's hard to talk about anything in biology without touching on evolution in some way, because living things have evolved and are continuing to evolve. Everything that we consider alive today has a common ancestor that first appeared about 3.8 billion years ago, which we'll talk about. There's 2 basic types of evidence for evolution. One is the fossil record, ancient organisms, things that are extinct for the most part, and comparing them to things that are living now. The other big piece of evidence for evolution is looking at things that are alive today. And we're all very familiar with the fossil kind of evidence. Everybody's heard about dinosaurs and other extinct things. Here's another extinct organism, the Basilosaurus, which is, from the name you might think it's some kind of dinosaur, but it was misnamed. It was lived long after the dinosaurs went extinct. It is in fact an ancient whale. So the name sticks, even though the person who discovered it didn't correctly identify it as an ancient whale. So we can compare fossil organisms to organisms that live today. And we'll talk more about whale evolution during our evolution chapter. But we can also look at things that are alive today and comparisons. So this is a nice SEM image of a paramecium. And we're going to hopefully look at live paramecium in lab. Paramecium are single-celled protists, and they are covered with these fine hairs called cilia, and that is how they move. Cilia can move, and we'll also talk about that in the next module. We also have cilia. We have cilia in several places in our bodies, but especially inside the bronchioles. They move the mucus and all the crud that sticks to the mucus, they move it out. And they move just like the cilia on a paramecium move. And there's more similarities than that. If we use an electron microscope and slice through the cilia of a paramecium and a human, in fact, we find the exact same structure. and it's made up of these little proteins called tubulins that are arranged into these long straw-like structures called microtubules, and we now can look at the genes. And Paramecium have genes for the tubulin protein. We have genes for the tubulin protein that are very similar. So the best explanation for this, why do humans and these single-celled organisms have this almost identical structure that works the same way, is made up of the same proteins, and in both cases it moves fluid. That's what cilia do. And Paramecium is swimming through the fluid. In our case, it's pushing the fluid out of our lungs. The best explanation is that we evolved from a common ancestor who had cilia. So this is a summary of evolution, and we will talk about evolution in more detail in Module 3. But the basics of evolution, if you've never heard it before, individuals in a population vary. They are different from each other. This variation can be passed on to the offspring. It's heritable. All populations produce more offspring than are going to survive, some spectacularly so, like for houseflies. Only about 1% of those houseflies are going to survive to adulthood. Individuals that are better adapted to the environment are much more likely to survive and reproduce, and over time, this difference in survival is going to change the population. So individuals don't evolve. Species and populations evolve and change generation after generation. Another phrase we hear along with evolution is survival of the fittest. So in evolutionary terms, fitness means surviving to reproduce. That's it. Fitness in evolutionary terms doesn't have anything to do with stronger, faster. It's whatever will help an organism survive in that particular environment, and it's very environment specific. So a fitness in a particular environment might be very unfit in another environment. Like a cactus here is a plant that is supremely adapted to live in very hot, dry environments with very low water availability. They have no leaves. That helps them conserve water. They're just a big fat stem. And to protect themselves from larger animals taking their water, because of course they're full of water, they're covered with thorns. So in a desert, this is a really good adaptation, all of these things. But if you took that cactus and planted it in your yard here, it probably wouldn't even last the summer because it's too wet, it would rot, it wouldn't survive the winter. It's just not adapted to our environment. Although we do have a native cactus in Illinois, but it doesn't look quite like that. But we do have a native cactus. If you would like to have cactus outside in your yard, there is one that lives around here. It's very slow growing though, so we don't see it a lot. So fitness, it has to do with the environment. So if the environment changes too much, an organism may no longer be adapted for that environment. This is one of my favorite evolution quotes from an early 20th century evolutionary biologist, Theodosius Dobzhansky, who is a Russian scientist. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And this is even more true today than when he first said this. Also, my other favorite evolution saying, which has been put about in various forms since Darwin, is that evolution, it's not stupid if it works, because mutations are random, and what is the best in a particular environment, or what might be the best, isn't always what evolves. And these are a couple of my favorite really crazy evolutionary experiments. This is a recently discovered group of spiders. They're very tiny. They only live in Australia. There are a dozen or so different species, and they're called the peacock jumping spiders. And the males display, and this is the most colorful one. There are others that aren't quite as colorful, but they do these They're tiny, tiny little spiders, and they do these great little dances. You can find some really good YouTube videos made by the scientists who study these. And all kinds of crazy stuff can evolve. Sea dragons are a type of seahorse. You probably heard of seahorses. They are very, very camouflaged, but they're just regular bony fish. They are related to tuna and goldfish. They're just fish. But they have undergone extreme adaptation for camouflage at the expense of being able to swim fast. So they're super slow swimmers, and their big claim to fame is camouflage. So we're going to talk a lot more about evolution in Module 3. So to wrap up this chapter, science starts with observations. We want to know how something works. So we form a hypothesis and then test that hypothesis. And you can test your hypothesis either with an experiment or by making more observations. If your hypothesis is not supported, you have to throw it away or modify it. And this is what makes science different from other ways of knowing about the world. Once you're ready to share your ideas with the rest of the scientific community, you go through a peer review process before they can be published. And so things that are just bad science usually get caught at some point. We're going to talk over the course of the semester about the big theories in biology, cell theory, heredity, energy conservation, and evolution. All right, on to chemistry.